We're going to begin with one of the true legends of the conservative movement, of conservative journalism, and that is John Gizzi. He has been, was for many years a correspondent with Human Events. He's been with Newsmax and Newsmax TV for the last several years. He has a virtually encyclopedic knowledge of politics in general. In addition to American politics, he's also very up to speed on things that are happening in the Hispanic world, in South America, and so on. John just got back from a trip there, which he may tell you about. John Gizzi has been attending the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference for, I think, maybe every one of the 35 years, this being our 35th annual. So he is one of the true loyal stalwarts. One thing to put in your minds before we welcome John, and that has to do with the straw poll. The straw poll will close this morning at 9 a.m., so you've only got an hour and a half. Please complete your straw poll between now and 9 o'clock. But now, please join with me in a warm welcome to John Gizzi of Newsmax.
I accept the nomination. It is such a pleasure. Here we go again. I'm up here and you're out there, and it's morning at PLC. It always seems that I'm here in the morning and you always turn out. It's just heartwarming. And I like this format for one reason and one reason alone. I get to see my old friends in person, and if they disagree with me or they don't understand something, they can talk about it after, as one friend to another. In the age of Zoom calls and Skypes and, of course, WhatsApp and texts and emails, it's a pleasure to see people one-on-one. And there's no misunderstandings either. You know, misunderstanding has become the great excuse in this age of mass communication. It reminds me of a story told to me by the late Secretary of State, Alexander Haig. He recalled a friend of his, a French general named Pierre, that he met through NATO. Pierre was retired at 70 years old. His wife, Marie, was 59. One day, Marie went to her doctor's, and to her shock, she discovered she was pregnant. She immediately called the officers' club where Pierre was playing cribbage with the boys. He picked up the phone. "Hello?" And she said, "You old goat, you know what you went and did? You got me pregnant." And there was a pause, and Pierre said, "Who's calling, please?" When I was a kid, I hated people who said when I was a kid. Now I say it all the time. When I was a young reporter, I came to the first Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. It was an incredible event to see all these activists gathering together, talking in a civil fashion, and discussing the issues and personalities of the day on the right. It was also a very different PLC from today's and a different conservative movement. To look back at it, the issues were different. I was on a panel on the issue of government intrusion in private lives and private business. There was a lady on the panel named Helen Waverly. Maybe some of you remember her. She ran a small business in her home in which she made baskets that you'd give to your mom or your sweetheart as a present. She felt she had complied with all the rules in the Keystone State, but it wasn't so. And as a result, the state shut her business down completely because she violated zoning laws, having a business in a residential area. The issue of cutting taxes across the board was sacrosanct. It was not a question of whether taxes would be cut or not, but just how many taxes would be cut, how many tax rates would be lowered, and whether taxes would be eliminated. And in terms of personalities, George H.W. Bush had only been president for a few months, but already those gathered here in Harrisburg for the PLC were beginning to question whether he was truly the heir to the mantle of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the gold standard in those days for us guys. Now, right now, that was then, this is now. The fact is that the issues, the personalities, the conservative movement itself has changed. How often do you hear people say to you, it's not Ronald Reagan's conservative movement, just as they say it's not Reagan's Republican Party? Well, when you do that, may I make a suggestion? Simply say, you're right, it isn't. The fact is that personalities change, times change, and of course, the issues change as well. Reagan himself was very different from the earlier political hero of some of us guys, Barry Goldwater. And in turn, both Reagan and Goldwater differed from a great conservative leader before and after World War II, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. The fact is that times do change and the issues do change. And let's take a look at that. The issues today, well, law and order. This is something we hear about all the time, from Washington County to Washington, D.C. And there is an outbreak of crime, a rise in lawlessness, and people want our law enforcement officials to crack down on crime hard. The question is, does that interfere with the state and localities' tradition of overseeing law enforcement around the country? In addition, immigration is an issue of critical importance these days. And immigration, one has to ask, will the federal government do its job of enforcing the law? As the late Congressman Sonny Bono of California used to say, well, if it's illegal immigration, then just enforce the law and do what's legal. In addition, we have to also consider that if the federal government doesn't do its job, do we then turn to state officials such as Texas Governor Greg Abbott and let him pass legislation such as SB 4 to allow law enforcement officials to find those who are in the country illegally and in some cases deport them or keep them out? That's a big question and a big issue. Trade. We used to all agree that free trade was the best solution to the area of international commerce. Well, that's true, but free trade has to be fair trade first, and hence one sees the call for more tariffs and the rising cheers for conservative candidates in the Union Hall. In the area of foreign policy, well, since the end of the Cold War, we have had an ongoing debate about whether there should be non-interventionism or an aggressive interventionism in the post-Cold War world. It's not an easy question, and situations have to be taken on a case-by-case basis. Well, let's look at it. We don't face a monolithic enemy of communism anymore. We face individual countries who dislike us: Russia, China, North Korea, Laos, and of course, the Ayatollahs in Iran and his goons in Gaza and his lackeys in Lebanon, all emboldened by a common denominator, a hatred of all things that are Western. We see this in many different forms. In Taiwan, Where I'm going in May, people live under threat from a colossus neighbor, very hostile to them, only 90 miles away. We see it in Russia in its onslaught 2 years ago against Ukraine, part of a 14-year pattern. And we saw it in the Middle East last fall. On October 7th, 2023, simply put, the hand that held the dagger plunged it into the back of its neighbor. Well, what do we do about it? Next week, when Congress returns, it's going to take up a measure of aid to Ukraine and very possibly to Israel as well. I'm not going to take sides on it, but I want you to consider something, and that is perpetual behavior of someone. Vladimir Putin, since the year 2008, has pursued a policy of hegemony unknown in Europe since the end of World War II. It started in 2008 with the seizure of a province known as Ossetia in the sovereign nation of Georgia. It continued in 2014 when he seized Crimea in 5 days. And now it goes on with the war that's raging in Ukraine right now. I would say, simply put, if you don't believe that someone's got to do something to stop him, he'll come back again and again. Maybe not next week, next month, or in a year, but I assure you he'll be coming back. He's got to be stopped. Now, I think overall we know that times do change and a new conservative approach has to be brought up. Few could say it as well as a Midwestern Republican congressman in 1858. The quiet dogmas of the quiet past are just not suitable to the turbulent problems of today. That congressman was Abraham Lincoln. Now, let's talk a little politics. I don't know about you, but I get polls brought to me all the time. Have you ever noticed that people are citing the polls and what the polls say, as if how the attitudes of voters today are important to what they do when they go to the polls, the real polls, that is, in November? Quite frankly, I always used to say there were only two polls I absolutely trusted, Lech Wałęsa and John Paul. Ipsos, the international pollster, just came out with a poll of Frenchmen, what they do immediately after having sex. 10% said they do it again. 15% said they smoke a cigarette. And 75% said they go home to their wives. Well, yes, let's talk a little politics. The House of Representatives is in a situation in which 52 members of both parties have decided to retire, seek another office, or simply resign, notably the former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. That makes it very uncertain in the prediction of the outcome of an election in which only 3 seats currently separate one party from the other, the closest division in the House since 1930. This reporter's prediction is that given this uncertainty with so many retirements, given the fact that redistricting in some states, something that should have been completed 3 years ago, is finally done. And in New York, Democrats gained only 1 seat under the new lines that were laid out. In North Carolina, Republicans could gain as many as 4 seats. Well, this reporter predicts that the House of Representatives will be as tight and as uncertain when the election is over as it is today. In the United States Senate, well, the current breakdown, as most of you know, is 51 Democrats to 49 Republicans. Actually, that's 48 Democrats and 3 independents who vote with Democrats for control of the Senate. How will this shape up? West Virginia is already a done deal. Republicans will pick up the seat, and then Republicans have opportunities to win in Michigan, in Montana, Nevada, Ohio, and, oh yes, Pennsylvania, where Bob Casey is facing the race of his life. Republicans should be cautiously optimistic that they're going to pick up the Senate. On the presidential race, let me note something. Recently, I completed a book by historian Irvin Gelman, who lives in Pennsylvania, The Campaign of the Century, about the 1960 election. I also watched the second Kennedy-Nixon debate on Google. You can get anything on Google. And that was just an experience to watch. People actually kept to the time that the moderator told them to keep to. They answered questions directly, and there was never a scintilla of personal comment in the debate, not even mentioning their wives and children. It was policy, and it was an intellectual feast, an historical feast for people like Paul Kanger, who love history and policy. The median age was the youngest in American history ever for candidates who were nominated by major parties for the highest office in the land. And of course, there was the historic significance of the first debate. Let's fast forward ahead to today. We have the oldest median age of candidates in history. And in all likelihood, there will be no televised debates this year. So it's a vast uncertainty ahead of us regarding the election. I couldn't predict how the market will be, whether interest rates will go up or down. I have a feeling they're going to go down, but let's see, or what the international situation will be at the time. I will say that the turnout will exceed that of 2020, and that was the highest turnout in an election in 96 years, and the outcome, as it was the last 2 times, will be very, very close. Now, it's always a pleasure for me to be here at PLC. It means a lot to come here, and I'm always moved by one thing in particular. PLC brings together disparate groups of conservatives. Economic conservatives argue with cultural conservatives. Traditional conservatives are arguing with the MAGA crowd, the Tea Partiers, and more recent incarnations of them. And the libertarians, well, they argue with just about everybody. But what inevitably happens, and has happened lo these 35 years, is that conservatives, in the end, stay friends. They sit down together for breakfast. They listen to me, and they all leave in a very good mood when it's done. In effect, people who come to PLC follow the admonition of the late playwright Rod Serling, creator of The Twilight Zone, who said, "For civilization to survive, we must all be civil." That makes a lot of sense, and that speaks volumes about PLC. Therefore, let us leave together as friends, as conservatives of different stripes, but as conservatives, and go forward, remembering the words of the late Green Bay Packers coach Vince Lombardi, that we can never achieve perfection, but at least if we strive for perfection, we'll reach excellence. This you will do. As PLC activists, you can do no less. Thank you. I love you. God bless you all.